In the shadows of the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, during the most tense years of the Cold War in the Middle East, a woman moved among the wounded with seemingly unwavering dedication. Amina Dawood al-Mufti carried in her hands not only bandages and medicine, but also secrets that would cross invisible borders towards Tel Aviv. The story of this Jordanian doctor represents one of the most complex and disturbing cases of international espionage in the 20th century, revealing how the region's geopolitical tensions transformed individual lives into instruments of silent warfare. For years, no one suspected that the woman caring for the Palestine Liberation Organization fighters maintained a double loyalty. Her medical reports contained information that went far beyond the patient's state of health. Every conversation recorded, every movement observed, every name murmured in moments of vulnerability was meticulously documented and transmitted through clandestine channels to Israeli intelligence services. The year 1975 would mark the end of this infiltration operation, when the discovery of her true identity would trigger a series of events that would transform Amina from agent to prisoner, beginning an even darker chapter of her existence. The complexity of this case transcends conventional espionage narratives, as it involves deep questions about identity, loyalty, and the human costs of prolonged conflicts. Amina al-Mufti was not born a spy, nor was she recruited for traditional ideological motivations. Her journey to the secret corridors of the Mossad was paved by devastating personal circumstances and decisions that irreversibly distanced her from her origins. The young woman who left Amman to study medicine in Europe did not imagine that she would return to the region decades later as one of the most valuable operatives of the Israeli secret services, infiltrated into the heart of the Palestinian nationalist movement. The political environment of the Middle East in the 1970s created unique conditions for long-term espionage operations. Lebanon, divided among different factions and serving as a base for Palestinian groups, became a natural laboratory for intelligence activities. In this context, health professionals enjoyed privileged access and almost unrestricted trust, characteristics that made doctors and nurses ideal targets for recruitment by espionage agencies. Amina's presence in the camps did not arouse suspicion precisely because her medical function justified her proximity to leaders and sensitive information. Infiltration techniques developed during the Cold War required agents capable of maintaining false identities for prolonged periods, enduring extreme psychological pressure while executing their missions. Amina demonstrated exceptional adaptability, managing to establish genuine relationships with people who, upon discovering her true identity, would feel profoundly betrayed. This constant duality between authentic medical care and clandestine information gathering demanded extraordinary emotional control from her, which would be tested to the limit when her cover was eventually compromised. The discovery of infiltrated agents in clandestine organizations often results in severe consequences, both for the spies and for those who involuntarily sheltered them. In Amina's case, the revelation of her true identity not only put an end to years of carefully planned operation, but also exposed security vulnerabilities that forced significant changes in the protection protocols of Palestinian leaders. Trust, a fundamental element for the functioning of any clandestine organization, was profoundly shaken, creating an environment of paranoia that would affect the future operations of the movement. Amina al-Mufti's capture in 1975 marked the beginning of a period of captivity that would last 5 years, during which she would face conditions that would test not only her physical resistance, but also her ability to keep secrets under extreme pressure. The interrogation methods employed by her captors followed established patterns for breaking the resistance of trained agents, combining prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and constant psychological pressure. During this period, Amina maintained an almost total silence about her activities and contacts, demonstrating the effectiveness of the training received and her determination to protect the espionage networks she had participated in. The complex geopolitical situation of the late 1970s created opportunities for prisoner exchange negotiations that previously seemed impossible. The Israeli government, under international pressure and considering the strategic value of its own citizens held captive, initiated indirect conversations that would eventually lead to Amina's release. These negotiations, conducted through international intermediaries, reflected the pragmatic reality that even declared enemies occasionally find reasons for limited cooperation when mutual interests are at stake. The prisoner exchange process involving Amina al-Mufti was carefully orchestrated to minimize public exposure and avoid precedents that could compromise future intelligence operations. The operation, carried out in neutral territory under the supervision of international organizations, followed established diplomatic protocols for similar situations, but with additional precautions due to the sensitive nature of the information Amina possessed. Her release was conditioned on commitments to silence that would extend for decades, transforming her into a phantom figure whose existence was known only to very restricted circles. Return to freedom, paradoxically, did not represent the end of Amina's difficulties. The woman who emerged from captivity was fundamentally different from the one who had been captured 5 years earlier. The trauma of prolonged confinement, combined with the awareness that her previous identity had been permanently compromised, required a process of personal reconstruction that would be as challenging as any espionage mission. Israel, the country for which she had risked everything, was now obligated to provide her with a new identity and a new life, but could not return the sense of purpose and belonging she had lost during the years of imprisonment. The integration of former agents into civil society represents one of the most complex and least discussed aspects of intelligence operations, revealing that the official end of a mission rarely coincides with the end of the personal consequences for those who carried it out. Amina al-Mufti's transformation from a respectable Jordanian citizen into a Mossad agent was not an instant process, but rather the result of a series of traumatic events that completely redefined her perception of the world and her national loyalty. Born in 1939 into an influential family in Amman, Amina grew up in a privileged environment where education and cultural sophistication were central values. Her father, a prosperous jeweler who served the Jordanian royal court, and her mother, an educated woman fluent in several languages, provided their daughter with exceptional opportunities for an Arab young woman of her time. This refined education included higher studies in Vienna, where Amina specialized in medical psychology and psychopathology, acquiring knowledge that would later prove crucial for her espionage activities. Academic life in Vienna during the 1960s exposed Amina to intellectual and political currents that challenged the traditional social structures of the Middle East. The city, still marked by the scars of World War II, but flourishing as a European cultural center, offered an environment of freedom and debate that contrasted dramatically with the social conventions of her native Jordan. It was in this cosmopolitan context that she met Moshe Perod, an Israeli Air Force pilot whose presence in Vienna was part of international military training programs. The relationship between a young Muslim Jordanian woman and an Israeli Jewish officer represented not only a personal union, but also a radical transgression of the social and political norms of both societies. Amina's decision to convert to Judaism and marry Moshe in 1966 resulted in her complete ostracism from her family and Jordanian society. This rupture was not merely social, but represented a fundamental rejection of her previous cultural and national identity. The marriage, performed in a small ceremony in Vienna, symbolized her deliberate choice to embrace a new life that would place her in direct opposition to the values and interests of her country of origin. The subsequent move to Israel in 1972 completed this transformation, making her a citizen of the state that many Jordanians considered their principal enemy. The tragedy that would define the future course of Amina's life occurred in January 1973, when Moshe's plane was shot down during a training flight near the Syrian border. The loss of her husband not only represented a devastating personal grief, but also the complete destruction of the new identity she had built. Without Moshe, her presence in Israel became problematic, as she remained a naturalized citizen of Arab origin in a country in a state of perpetual war with its neighbors. The trauma of loss, combined with the social isolation resulting from her foreign origin, created psychological conditions that made her receptive to approaches from Israeli intelligence services. Amina's recruitment process by the Mossad, followed established patterns for attracting individuals in situations of emotional vulnerability. The agents responsible for the initial approach knew how to exploit both her desire for revenge for her husband's death and her desperate need to find a new purpose for her fragmented existence. The offer was not presented simply as a job, but as an opportunity to honor Mossad's memory through service to the Israeli state. This psychologically sophisticated formulation transformed her personal pain into patriotic motivation, a fundamental process for the creation of effective and loyal agents. The intensive training Amina received in secret facilities in the Negev desert was designed to exploit her exceptional linguistic skills and her deep knowledge of human psychology. Her fluency in Arabic, Hebrew, English, French, German, Turkish, and Circassian made her a versatile operative capable of assuming multiple identities according to the needs of the mission. More importantly, her medical background provided a perfect professional cover for infiltration activities, as doctors were universally respected and had privileged access to sensitive information in any society. The creation of the cover identity for the mission in Lebanon required months of meticulous preparation. Documents were forged, references were established through international contact networks, and a detailed biography was constructed to withstand rigorous scrutiny. The new Amina al-Mufti would be presented as a European-educated doctor specializing in rehabilitation medicine, motivated by humanitarian principles to work in conflict zones. This identity effectively exploited the prevailing stereotypes about Western medical professionals working in developing countries, providing a plausible explanation for her presence in Palestinian refugee camps. Amina's insertion into the target environment was executed through legitimate international medical organizations operating in Lebanon. Her arrival in Beirut in 1973 coincided with a period of intensification of regional tensions, when the presence of armed Palestinian groups in Lebanese territory created constant friction with Israeli forces and other local factions. This chaotic environment provided ideal cover for espionage activities, as the urgent need for medical care made questions about the credentials and motivations of health professionals relatively rare. The long-term infiltration strategy adopted by the Mossad in Amina's case reflected a sophisticated understanding of the psychological dynamics necessary for lasting espionage operations. Instead of seeking immediate information, the agency invested considerable time allowing her to establish genuine relationships and gain trust through effective medical work. This patient approach would eventually provide access to intimate circles of the Palestinian leadership that would be impossible to penetrate through more direct methods. The tragic irony of this situation lay in the fact that Amina genuinely cared for her patients, creating deep ethical dilemmas about the nature of her double loyalty and the consequences of her actions for those who trusted her. Amina al-Mufti's successful infiltration into the intimate circles of the Palestinian leadership in Lebanon was facilitated by the unique conjunction of her medical qualifications, linguistic skills, and the growing need for specialized care in the refugee camps. During 1973 and 1974, her reputation as a competent and dedicated doctor spread rapidly among the different Palestinian factions, resulting in invitations to treat not only wounded fighters, but also important leaders suffering from chronic medical conditions. This proximity to key figures of the Palestine Liberation Organization provided her with access to strategic information of inestimable value to Israeli military and political planners. Amina's work in the camps transcended basic medical care, as she gradually assumed responsibilities that included sanitary resource planning, training local paramedics, and coordination with international humanitarian organizations. These expanded functions created natural opportunities to observe personnel movements, identify command structures, and document available resources for different groups. Her privileged position allowed her to witness strategic discussions, observe communication patterns, and identify personal and political relationships between leaders that were rarely visible to external observers. The proximity to Yasser Arafat, charismatic leader of the PLO, represented the pinnacle of the infiltration operation. Arafat, known for his distrust of strangers and his dependence on very restricted intimate circles, accepted Amina into his entourage mainly due to the enthusiastic recommendations of commanders who had been treated by her. The doctor-patient relationship created a unique dynamic of intimacy and trust that allowed private conversations during consultations and treatments. On these occasions, Arafat often discussed personal concerns about his health, future political strategies, and evaluations of other Palestinian and Arab leaders. The information collected by Amina during this period included details about Palestinian military capabilities, operational plans, funding structures, relationships with sponsoring Arab states, and internal tensions among different factions. Her reports, transmitted through clandestine communication channels established by the Mossad, provided Israeli analysts with unique insights into Palestinian strategic thinking and allowed anticipation of important political and military movements. The exceptionally high quality of this information made Amina one of the most valuable sources of Israeli intelligence services during this critical period. The method of information transmission utilized traditional espionage techniques adapted to the specific environment of Lebanon. Amina developed detailed reports during her time off, using seemingly innocent medical codes to disguise sensitive information. These documents were subsequently transferred through a network of intermediaries that included other medical professionals, journalists, and diplomats operating in the region. The sophistication of this communication system reflected years of development by the Mossad and the strategic importance attributed to the operation. Maintaining her cover required constant psychological vigilance to avoid behavior that could arouse suspicion. Amina developed genuine personal relationships with Palestinian colleagues, participated in political discussions with apparent sincerity, and demonstrated authentic empathy for the sufferings of the refugees. This constant duality between her genuine feelings as a doctor and her obligations as a spy created enormous psychological tensions that were carefully monitored by her superiors in the Mossad through periodic evaluation meetings. The effectiveness of the operation was measured not only by the quality of the information collected, but also by Amina's ability to maintain her position without arousing suspicion for prolonged periods. For almost 2 years, she managed to balance these conflicting demands with notable success, establishing herself as a respected and trustworthy figure in the Palestinian medical community. Her success was facilitated by the intrinsically international nature of medicine, which created plausible explanations for her presence and behaviors that might seem suspicious in other contexts. However, long-term espionage operations inevitably face increasing risks of exposure as time passes. Prolonged familiarity with the target environment increases the chances of inconsistencies being noticed. Personal relationships can create conflicting loyalties, and changes in political circumstances can alter the level of scrutiny applied to foreigners. In Amina's case, the combination of these factors would eventually create the conditions that would lead to the discovery of her true identity and the dramatic end of her mission. The discovery of Amina's true identity resulted from a security investigation initiated after a seemingly minor incident that aroused suspicion about possible infiltrations into Palestinian leadership circles. Syrian intelligence sources had warned about the presence of Israeli agents in Palestinian camps in Lebanon, leading to a systematic review of the backgrounds of all foreigners in sensitive positions. The investigation of Amina, conducted by counter-espionage experts trained in techniques developed during the Cold War, revealed subtle inconsistencies in her biography that eventually led to the discovery of her true loyalty. The revelation that the respected and trustworthy doctor was actually a Mossad agent sent shockwaves throughout the entire Palestinian structure. The betrayal was perceived not only as a violation of personal trust, but as a profound political humiliation that exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in the organization's security. The strategic implications were terrifying, as the extent of the information Amina had had access to meant that virtually every aspect of Palestinian operations had been compromised during the period of her activity. Amina al-Mufti's capture in October 1975 was preceded by a meticulous investigation that lasted several weeks, during which Palestinian counter-espionage experts, aided by Syrian and Soviet consultants, built an irrefutable case against the doctor, who had won the trust of the highest echelons of the organization. The initial discovery of inconsistencies in her documentation led to a deeper verification of her European background, a process that revealed connections with Mossad recruitment networks operating in European universities during the 1960s. When confronted with evidence of her true identity, Amina maintained a posture of categorical denial, a strategy she had learned during her training as a fundamental technique to protect ongoing operations. The interrogation process that followed reflected the perceived gravity of the situation by Palestinian leaders, who understood that the infiltration had compromised not only past operations, but also put the organization's future activities at risk. Specialized technicians in psychological resistance breaking were brought from different Arab countries to conduct questioning sessions that combined psychological pressure, sensory deprivation, and manipulation techniques developed over decades of conflict in the region. Despite the intensity of these procedures, Amina demonstrated exceptional resistance, maintaining silence on operational details that could expose other agents or compromise future Mossad missions. The decision about Amina's fate generated intense debates within the Palestinian leadership, reflecting different philosophies on how to deal with espionage and betrayal in national liberation movements. Some leaders argued for immediate execution as an example to discourage future infiltrations, while others advocated keeping her in captivity as potential bargaining chip for future negotiations with Israel. The final decision to keep her alive represented a pragmatic choice based on the assessment that her value as a prisoner outweighed the symbolic benefits of her public execution. The confinement conditions imposed on Amina were designed to maximize psychological pressure while preserving her life for possible future exchanges. Held in an underground facility near Sidon, she was subjected to rigorous isolation that included deprivation of human contact, limited exposure to natural light, and irregular provision of food and water. These conditions, intended to break her psychological resistance and force her to cooperate with interrogators, followed counter-espionage manuals developed by Soviet experts and adapted for use by Arab clandestine organizations. During the first months of captivity, Amina faced frequent interrogation sessions that used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to try to extract information about Mossad structures, identities of other agents, and details about planned future operations. Her interrogators, trained to recognize signs of psychological breakdown, applied carefully calibrated pressure that alternated between direct threats and promises of improved treatment in exchange for cooperation. Amina's consistent resistance to these techniques demonstrated both the quality of her training and her personal determination to protect information that could cost the lives of other agents. The psychological war conducted against Amina included strategies aimed at convincing her that she had been abandoned by the Israeli services and that her capture had not been officially reported or acknowledged. Interrogators regularly claimed that Israel had denied any knowledge of her activities and that no effort was being made to secure her release. These tactics of psychological isolation were complemented by disinformation about external events, including claims that the war had ended, that peace agreements had been signed, or that fundamental political changes had occurred in the Middle East. Amina's adaptation to the extreme conditions of confinement revealed extraordinary psychological resources that combined professional training as a doctor with resistance techniques learned during her time at the Mossad. She developed rigorous daily routines that included mental exercises to maintain intellectual acuity, systematic review of medical knowledge to preserve professional competence, and meditation techniques adapted to sensory deprivation environments. This mental discipline provided essential psychological structure for survival in conditions that had broken many other prisoners. The impact of prolonged confinement on Amina's physical health was carefully monitored by her captors, who understood that her premature death would eliminate any value she might have in future negotiations. Basic medical care was provided when necessary, but treatments were limited to the minimum necessary to preserve life without providing significant comfort. This calculated approach reflected the Palestinian experience with long-term prisoners and the delicate balance between psychological pressure and the preservation of strategic value. Information about Amina's captivity circulated discreetly through regional intelligence networks, creating knowledge of her situation among various espionage services without resulting in official confirmation of her identity or location. This limited circulation of information served the interests of different parties, allowing Palestinians to signal possession of a valuable asset without revealing details that could compromise their security, while providing the Mossad with sufficient knowledge to initiate planning for possible rescue operations or exchange negotiations. The sensitive nature of these communications required indirect channels that often passed through neutral intermediaries or international organizations. The gradual transformation of Amina during this period reflected the inevitable psychological impact of prolonged confinement under extreme conditions. Guard reports noted changes in her behavior that included periods of prolonged silence alternating with moments of intense activity, development of repetitive mannerisms, and alterations in sleep patterns that suggested significant psychological stress. These changes, although worrying for her long-term mental health, did not result in the breakdown of her resistance or cooperation with interrogators, demonstrating exceptional determination that impressed even her captors. The final period of Amina al-Mufti's captivity coincided with significant geopolitical changes in the Middle East that created new opportunities for prisoner exchange negotiations between Israel and Palestinian organizations. The signing of the Camp David Accords in 1978 and the subsequent international pressure for a peaceful resolution of regional conflicts established diplomatic precedents that facilitated indirect conversations about humanitarian issues, including the situation of prisoners held by different parties in conflict. The Israeli government, under the leadership of Menachem Begin, demonstrated growing interest in negotiations that could result in the release of Israeli citizens in Palestinian captivity. The first indications of a possible exchange involving Amina emerged through unofficial diplomatic channels that used neutral intermediaries to probe the positions of both sides without formal commitments. International humanitarian organizations, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, played crucial roles in facilitating these preliminary conversations, providing discreet cover for communications that would have been impossible through traditional diplomatic channels. The highly classified nature of Amina's identity required special precautions to avoid public exposure that could compromise future intelligence operations. The structure of the negotiation that would eventually result in Amina's release was complicated by the need to balance different types of prisoners held by each side. Israel held hundreds of Palestinian prisoners convicted of activities related to terrorism and armed resistance, while Palestinian organizations held a much smaller number of Israelis, including captured soldiers and suspected spies. The numerical disparity created challenges in establishing equivalencies that both sides considered acceptable, forcing negotiators to consider qualitative factors such as strategic importance and individual symbolic value. The Israeli evaluation of Amina's value as an asset for exchange was complicated by the fact that her period of operational activity had definitively ended with her capture. Unlike soldiers or civilians captured during military operations, exposed spies rarely retain operational value after the discovery of their identities. However, humanitarian considerations, diplomatic precedents, and the symbolism of not abandoning agents who had served faithfully weighed significantly in the Israeli government's deliberations on the feasibility of the exchange. On the Palestinian side, the willingness to negotiate for Amina's release reflected strategic assessments about the benefits of demonstrating humanitarian flexibility versus the value of keeping prisoners as instruments of political pressure. Palestinian leaders understood that humanitarian gestures could generate international goodwill and establish precedents for future negotiations on broader issues. Simultaneously, the release of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli prisons would provide immediate, tangible benefits and reinforce the legitimacy of the Palestinian leadership among its constituents. The specific identification of Palestinian prisoners to be included in the exchange required delicate negotiations that considered both the political profile and the length of service of the individuals involved. Israel insisted on excluding prisoners convicted of attacks that resulted in multiple civilian deaths, while Palestinian negotiators pressed for the inclusion of high-visibility figures that would provide maximum propaganda impact. The final agreement included 2 Palestinian prisoners serving life sentences for armed resistance activities, a choice that reflected carefully calibrated compromises between humanitarian considerations and political realities. The exchange operation was planned with military precision to minimize security risks and avoid unnecessary exposure of participants. Larnaca Airport in Cyprus was selected as a neutral location due to its security facilities and history of similar operations conducted under international supervision. Representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross assumed responsibility for logistical coordination, ensuring that established protocols for prisoner transfer were strictly followed. The execution of the exchange on February 13, 1980, followed precise timetables that minimized exposure time and possibilities of interference by groups opposing the negotiations. Amina was transported from her prison in Lebanon to Larnaca Airport under heavy escort, while the Palestinian prisoners were simultaneously moved from Israeli prisons to the same destination. The synchronization of these operations required constant communication between all parties to ensure that commitments were honored simultaneously. The moment of Amina's release marked the official end of her career as an intelligence agent, but initiated an equally challenging period of reintegration into a society that had changed significantly during her 5 years of absence. The conditions of her release included severe restrictions on public discussion of her experiences, limitations that would remain in force for subsequent decades. Israel assumed responsibility for providing her with a new identity, necessary medical care and financial support, but could not restore the sense of purpose and identity that had been fragmented by years of confinement and trauma. The woman who emerged from captivity in 1980 was fundamentally different from the confident agent who had begun her mission in Lebanon 7 years earlier. The psychological impact of prolonged confinement, combined with the awareness that her previous identity had been permanently compromised, created adaptive challenges that would persist for decades. Her story illustrates the lasting personal consequences of espionage operations, revealing that the official end of a mission rarely coincides with the end of the human consequences for those who carried them out. Amina al-Mufti's reintegration into Israeli society after 5 years of captivity presented unique challenges that reflected both the psychological scars of her experience and the practical realities of protecting the identity of a former agent whose exposure continued to pose security risks. The reconstruction process began in a specialized medical facility near Tel Aviv, where multidisciplinary teams of psychiatrists, plastic surgeons, and rehabilitation specialists worked to restore her physical and mental health. Medical interventions included extensive dental procedures to correct damage resulting from inadequate care during captivity, reconstructive surgeries for visible scars, and intensive psychological treatment to address traumas related to prolonged confinement. The creation of a new identity for Amina required significant resources from Israeli intelligence services, who developed a complete biography for Dr. Ruth Nisanoff, a supposed doctor born in Eastern Europe who had immigrated to Israel during the 1970s. This identity was supported by meticulously forged documentation that included university diplomas, records of previous employment, and professional references verifiable through international networks established by the Mossad. The sophistication of this identity creation operation reflected both the importance attributed to Amina's protection and the experience accumulated by the Israeli services in similar procedures. Amina's initial employment as a psychiatrist at Sheba Hospital represented a careful attempt to use her legitimate medical qualifications while providing a professional environment that could facilitate her gradual readaptation to civil society. Her placement in the anesthesiology department, directed by Dr. Yona Ellen, a doctor known for his historical involvement in the capture of Adolf Eichmann, was not a coincidence, but a reflection of a deliberate policy of employing former agents in positions supervised by individuals who understood the complexities of their situations. This strategy provided additional protection while allowing discreet monitoring of her psychological adjustment. Amina's adaptation to hospital work deeply revealed the lasting impact of her traumatic experiences. Colleagues noted her technical competence, but also observed behaviors that suggested significant difficulties with personal intimacy and interpersonal trust. Her tendency to avoid personal conversations, preference for working alone, and startled reactions to unexpected noises were recognizable symptoms of post-traumatic stress that persisted despite intensive psychological treatment. These manifestations created social distancing that prevented the formation of meaningful relationships with co-workers. The loss of her protector at the hospital when Dr. Ellen left his position exposed Amina to the scrutiny of new supervisors who were unaware of her true identity and questioned qualifications that seemed inconsistent with her practical performance. The gaps in her medical knowledge, resulting from the years lost during captivity, and the differences between European training and Israeli practices became increasingly evident as professional demands increased. The administrative decision to dismiss her from the hospital represented not only loss of employment, but also the collapse of the support system carefully constructed to facilitate her reintegration. The subsequent move to southern Israel, where Amina found employment at a therapeutic resort near the Dead Sea, marked a new phase of her life characterized by geographical isolation and deliberate simplicity. Working with patients suffering from dermatological conditions provided limited satisfaction, but avoided the psychological complexities associated with more demanding medical positions. Her life adopted monastic patterns that included solitary residence, minimal social interactions, and rigorously structured routines that echoed the disciplines developed during captivity to maintain psychological stability. The decision to eventually settle in Nazareth represented a significant choice that reflected both practical needs and the emotional complexities of her situation. The city, with a predominantly Arab population, offered an environment where her appearance and accent would not arouse excessive curiosity, allowing for greater anonymity than would be possible in more homogeneous Israeli communities. Simultaneously, this choice created deep ironies, as she lived among people who shared a cultural heritage with those who had held her captive. The private medical clinic that Amina established in Nazareth during the 1990s provided her with the first genuine opportunity since her release to find professional purpose and personal satisfaction. Specializing in dermatology, the medical practice attracted patients who appreciated her technical competence and personal dedication, qualities that transcended cultural and political barriers. For many Arab patients, she simply represented a skilled doctor who offered compassionate care, an identity that allowed relationships based on fundamental human needs instead of political complexities. The close relationship that Amina developed with a local Arab family represented a significant psychological breakthrough after decades of emotional isolation. The mutual trust that was gradually established through medical care provided to the family patriarch, combined with genuine kindness demonstrated by the patient's wife, created bonds that transcended cultural and historical differences. This family became a substitute for the social connections she had lost through choices made decades earlier, providing a sense of belonging that had been absent since her youth in Amman. The partial reconciliation with her Jordanian family after the signing of the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty in 1994 represented a courageous attempt to reconnect with roots she had rejected 40 years earlier. The periodic visits to Amman were emotionally charged, combining the joy of reunion with family members who believed her dead with the embarrassment resulting from decades of separation and choices that remained incomprehensible to many family members. These limited reconciliations provided important emotional closure, but also reinforced the awareness that bridges burned decades earlier could not be completely rebuilt. Amina's final years of life were marked by growing isolation and melancholic reflections on the personal costs of choices made during her youth. Her decision to bequeath all assets to the Arab family that had cared for her represented a final rejection of the Israeli institutions she had served faithfully, but which had never managed to provide her with the sense of home or identity she sought. Her death in 2008, followed by a discreet burial in a Circassian cemetery in Amman, concluded a life that had been defined by divided loyalties, extreme sacrifices, and a fruitless search for reconciliation between irreconcilable aspects of her fragmented identity.